Good morning. Thank you for coming out to Constitution Day and our Constitution Week events. Today we have a great panel of speakers that are going to be presenting to you not just on the Constitution, but proposed amendments to the Constitution, in particular the Equal Rights Amendment. So I'm going to be reading to you the biography. By the way, my name is Professor Richard Tapia. I'm a professor of political science and international relations here at Miami-Dade College North Campus and at the Meek campus. And with me, I have not only Representative Dottie Joseph, but Professor Dr. Dyer, a professor of history. So let me introduce first State Representative Dottie Joseph, who is the state representative in House District 108 that represents North Miami, Liberty City, City of Miami, parts of Miami-Dade County. And Dottie Joseph, or Representative Joseph, was born in Haiti and grew up in North Miami and attended Miami-Dade County Public Schools. I believe she attended Charles Drew Elementary and also Dash, which is Design and Architecture School, high school. She also graduated from Yale University, where she received a Bachelor's of Art, and she attended Georgetown University Law Center, where she obtained her Juris Doctorate, which is her law degree. Dottie, or Representative Joseph, has been a champion for community empowerment and an advocate for civil rights and human rights since she was a teenager, and has taken her passion and service to Tallahassee. She is currently a state representative who is advocating for equal access to quality education, affordable health care, public safety, and economic development to improve the quality of lives for all who live, work, and reside in the district. She is also the sponsor of the Equal Rights Amendment. Florida is, at the moment, would be one of the last states to ratify the Equal Rights Amendment, and if Florida ratifies, it would be added to the U.S. Constitution. So she has been the sponsor of this amendment within the Florida legislature, and she once again represents House District 108 in one of Miami-Dade County's most diverse districts, and she intends to serve the entire community. Also, it has come to our attention that she will be teaching with us in this fall semester. She will be teaching a civil law course that starts September 30th. You could still register and sign up for the class. And I think it would be a great honor to have such a great professor teach you about civil law and all of the different legal implications that may reside in a non-criminal setting. So if you have space available, if you are a pre-law or paralegals major, or if you just want to take an elective, Professor Joseph will be teaching this course. And it's civil law, and the reference number, I believe the course number would be...
Course number would be,
if you want, write it down. Take out a pen and paper.
3044.
3044. Just putting it out there in case of, well, some of you guys are going to wait to the end of the presentation. I guarantee you, at the end of the presentation, you're going to wish you would have written down that number. We'll say it again, 3044. All right. Now, Dr. Dyer is currently teaching here at Miami-Dade College. His classes have already started, so you could basically pick him up next semester. Do you have a mini-term coming up? Or?
I have one that started on Monday.
One that started on Monday?
Students.
Perfect. What is it, AMH?
AMH 2020.
2020, American history. 2020 is from 1865 to the present. Two students. He's a fan. So Dr. Dyer is a historian specializing in U.S. urban history who received his PhD from CUNY. That's the City University of New York. Graduate Center, New York City. He has taught in higher education for over 10 years in New Orleans, New York, and now we have him here in the 305. I think he's going to be 305 till he dies from here on out. We're hoping. We're hoping he stays with us for a very long time and all the way till retirement. His specialization has been on unionization and the effects of unions on social policy and so forth. Now, I know he doesn't like for me to toot his horn, but I'm going to toot a little bit. We're very fortunate to have Dr. Dyer here as a professor of history, and we're very happy that he's going to be talking a little bit about the history and the evolution of voting rights within the Constitution and the Equal Rights Amendment. So with that said, let me get right into the panel discussion. So we're going to ask a few questions to our panel, and then we're going to open it up for the students at the end so you could ask them some questions. And the first question I'm going to ask is going to be to State Representative Dottie Joseph, which, by the way, Representative Joseph was very gracious to join us here. She has to catch a flight to go back to Tallahassee because her work is never done, especially in Tallahassee, when we're talking about state funding, when we're talking about advocating for quality education, and Miami-Dade College has no greater friend than that of Representative Joseph. So she's going to be departing soon, a little bit towards the end of the program, a little bit early to be able to catch that flight. So the first question goes to Representative Joseph, and it's a two-part question, but I'm going to start off with what motivated you to get into public service as a profession, specifically to advocate for the Equal Rights Amendment to the Constitution?
All right. First of all, good morning. Bonjour. Buenos dias. All right, just making sure we all here and awake. So my name is Dottie Joseph. Now, I guess I was kind of born into a life of public service. My dad's a pastor and my mommy's a nurse. So my whole life, we've been basically attending to the needs of folks. What led me into public service? So when I was in high school, I interned at the Miami-Dade Public Defender's Office. That was my first foray beyond like teaching Sunday school into public service. And when I did that, I really didn't like the criminal justice system. And I decided, you know what, I don't want to be a lawyer. Because I thought there were a lot of people going to jail that just needed medical attention. Now we see a different response with the opioid epidemic, and one would wonder what the difference is, but in some instances it's fairly clear. So once I decided, you know, I'm not going to be a lawyer, I went on to college. I had the opportunity to go to Yale University. And while I was there, I interned with Congressman Peter Deutsch, first in his district office here in Florida, and then he invited me to go work for him over the summer in DC while I was in college. So I did that. I was his legislative correspondent, and I was like, you know what? I don't like how the government works. Like, they don't know what's in the bills. Whatever you think is supposed to happen, that's not what happens. And I was like, this is so bootleg. I do not like how the sausage is made, and I don't want any part of it. So I went on about my business, graduated, and I had the opportunity to work with President Carter in Atlanta doing democracy development work in Latin America, the Caribbean, and West Africa. And I was like, this I could do. I could be a track 2 diplomat. I can hang out in the background. You never need to know that I exist. And I can just do good and make sure that the world doesn't go to war. Like, that seems like something I could sign up for. So I did a program in The Hague in the Netherlands on mediation and conflict resolution. And we had people from all around the world come and teach us about different aspects of that foray. And one of the things that became apparent was, you know, you can just go along with the system, or you can make the system better so that it has a better outcome, so that there is actually freedom and justice for all. But if nobody demands it, it's not going to happen on its own. So all of my mentors are like, listen, you're passionate about civil rights and human rights. You really need to go to law school. Now remember, I told you I decided I didn't want to be a lawyer. So I sucked it up and I went to law school. And I had a couple of additional experiences, both here in the United States and abroad, working with refugees in Uganda, working with refugees in Egypt that came from Sudan, and a whole host of other experiences. So then by the time I got out of that, I was doing the Lord work. I wasn't there to go make big bucks at fancy firms. I was there to do public interest work, which is basically civil rights and human rights. Those are the things that I'm most passionate about. So then what led me to run for office for a long time, as I told you, I was not interested in running for office. And I can give you a whole list of reasons why I didn't want to. I have a very low tolerance for BS. I like my privacy, and the list goes on and on. But people would constantly ask me to run for office. I was just tune them out until 2015. At that time, I was serving as deputy city attorney for one of the local cities here. So technically, I was already a public servant, right? It was an immigrant mother's dream job. I was making 6 figures, had a little pension coming in. And then 2 things happened. One is my role as attorney was to advise the commission on how to vote. And I take the extra step of letting them know, here's the impact of your vote on the community. But at the end of the day, whether it was a good decision, bad decision, corrupt, not corrupt, it was their vote to make, not mine, right? And a lot of times between them and the person who held this seat before me as state representative, they would let our communities down. And I got tired of begging people to do the right thing and decided to just try to claim a seat at the table to get it right myself. So that's one reason. Also, at the end of 2015, I was involved in not 1, not 2, but 3 car accidents, none of which were my fault. And I'm still dealing with injuries from that to this day. But it forced me to pause and really reevaluate my life. I was already, doing good work. I was a public servant, but I knew I could be doing more, right? And I just thought, what else could I do? What else do I need to do to help people? I don't know how much time I have left on this earth, but for whatever time I have, I want to do as much as I can for as many as I can for as long as I can. So that's the public interest question. Why the ERA? Simple. I told you what I'm passionate about, freedom and justice for all. Part of getting to justice for all is having equal rights for men and women. The ERA is not a complicated thing. It just declares literally that men and women are equal. Why is that important under law? I'll get into that in a little bit more. I'll let us continue on with the panel so you can kind of get a grasp of it, but that's why I advocate for what I advocate for.
Perfect. Great response. I usually don't get that type of response in my lectures. Great job. All right. The next question is for Dr. Dyer. And I basically, I'm going to ask you, how do you feel we've evolved when it comes to voting rights, in particular to the U.S. Constitution? And what effect would the Equal Rights Amendment, also known as the ERA, is going to have on voting rights and when it comes to, let's say, the enfranchisement of rights to include more people?
Well, so as many of you know, if you've taken a history class here, and many of you now will be forced to take AMH 2020 with me because of legal changes in Tallahassee, thankfully. One of the kind of key things to think about with the Constitution is the Constitution didn't do a lot about voting rights when it was originally made. Ironically, the Constitution evolved into one of the, through the amendment process, one of the main protectors of individuals' voting rights, right? So historically, voting rights were left to the states, and it was in some ways kind of the Wild West, and it wasn't until the 15th Amendment that really enfranchises black men as voters in this country that we start to see kind of the Constitution being pushed as a major protector of your individual right to vote. We all know that the Constitution, you have individual right to free speech, and there's allegedly protections from unlawful search and seizure and a variety of other things that you may or may not have had violated in the last few years. Over time, right, we have the inclusion of African American people, and then eventually the inclusion of women in the 19th Amendment, and actually the 26th Amendment, which rolls the voting age back down to 18. So in a lot of ways, the Constitution has evolved significantly in expanding who can vote. Now, what you have to remember, though, is that's not by the good graces of politicians. That is a result of long-term social struggles in our country that pushed for the right to vote, right? And on the books, African American men had the right to vote from in the late 1860s. This one didn't work. Bad sound. This one's better. It sounds better. I sound nicer.
Yeah.
I don't actually sound that way. Okay. All right. Well, here's what I really sound like. But so you may have the right to vote on the books, but you have to enforce that right? And that's what happened. That's why one of the reasons that sparked the civil rights movement. Of course, many things. So the Constitution has become this kind of repository for our voting rights, thankfully. And in terms of the Equal Rights Amendment, there's been a very, very long struggle to actually pass and ratify the Equal Rights Amendment, since the 1970s, correct? I mean, this has been a fairly simple amendment, right, as Representative Joseph said, guaranteeing equality of men and women before the law. In terms of the guarantee on voting, I'm not actually sure what the impact would be. Maybe Representative Joseph can let us know more about that. But as of right now, the voting question is still not solved, right? As we know, we're having a lot of debates in this country about, can you purge voter rolls? Who gets purged? Can felons vote? We're still having a fight in Florida, right? We voted, most of us actually in this campus and a variety of other places, we voted to allow people who were felons, right, to be re-enfranchised, right? We were one of the few states left where you couldn't vote. But we're having a fight over it still about whether or not the kind of penalties people have are going to prevent them from voting. So this is an ongoing issue, and it affects millions and millions of Americans. And for us in a swing state like Florida, right, we are a prize that everyone is after. And so really slim margins determine things like who's president, who's senator, who's governor, and so on. So it's something to really kind of pay attention to.
Thank you, Dr. Dyer. I'm going to pose a similar question to Representative Joseph. The question is going to be, how would the Equal Rights Amendment, first of all, why is the Equal Rights Amendment important? We have an equal protection clause that basically says that everyone will have equal protection under the law. How would the Equal Rights Amendment be different, and why is it important to have the Equal Rights Amendment? Why is it important to advocate for it, and how would it affect the evolution of rights in America?
Great question. Thank you very much. So the ERA basically just says, it's hardcore simple. Here we go. Equal rights under the law shall not be denied to anyone on the basis of sex. Is that complicated? No, right? He talked about the Constitution. Let me back up and get there first. How many people knew that black women didn't have the right to vote when the Constitution was passed? How many people think that black men had the vote when the Constitution was passed? Did you know that poor white men could not vote when the Constitution was passed? You didn't know that. So to understand our Constitution, you have to understand its origins. You had to be propertied, you had to be wealthy, and you had to be a white man, period, end of story. And not just white man, but like white man that came from certain countries. Because you may or may not know this, but Irish men were not considered white men back then. Did you know that? You gotta check your history, because a lot of these things evolve. What's cool one day is not necessarily cool the next day. Jewish might seem like white in some instances here, but in a lot of places, it's still not considered white when you're thinking about a white man. And Miami's a little bit interesting when it comes to the totem pole of hierarchy of privilege, because in most places in the United States, the top of the totem pole is a white man, right? A rich white man on top of that. But the top of the totem pole here, guess who's at the top of our totem pole? Oh, don't say nothing, let me see. Raise a hand, just say it out there. Go ahead. Which Hispanic? Because it's not the Mexican. Go ahead. Cuban who? Huh? Cuban American white men. Wealthy. They're at the top of our totem pole in Miami-Dade County. If you didn't know that, you better ask somebody. We're gonna keep going. Let's get back to the ERA. So why is this even a thing? Most people think that men and women already have equal rights, right? Like, you think that our laws make sure that that happens, but it's not true. When you look at the pay wage gap, you know, women of color, let's just start with regular white women. They're making like 70-something cents on the dollar for for the same work that they do compared to a white man. Black women make like 50-something cents on the dollar. And I can give you the exact figures if you're curious, or just go to my Facebook page and scroll back to Equal Pay Day and you'll see the exact numbers. And then Hispanic women make even less, and then Asian women make even less. So the point is, it's not equal. And what this law would do is just make sure that it's equal across the board. Voting, interestingly enough, is probably the only area where technically, you know, there's de jure and there's de facto. De jure means under the law, and de facto means what happens in real life, in day to day, right? De jure, women are allowed to vote, right? What happens in certain communities where they think the women or the black women or the Hispanic women are voting too much? Then you start to get things like voter suppression. So the de facto implication is they start purging voter rolls and doing a whole host of other voter suppression related things to make sure that your vote is not counted. All right, so the problem is over 70% of Americans think that we already have equal rights. Well, it does not. The Constitution does not protect it. And what the ERA would do is make sure that we have a legal, consistent system to make sure that there is a standard that's applied across the law. Now, for you to understand how this works, you have to understand a little bit about constitutional law. In order for you to assert a right under the Constitution, there needs to be a constitutional hook. The First Amendment, the Second Amendment, right to bear arms, First Amendment, freedom of speech. In the case of women, there is no particular thing. We'd like to think it's the 14th Amendment that would do the equal protection, but in practice, that has not been the case, and the courts have not interpreted it as such. And if you don't want to believe me, you don't have to take my word for it. Let me give you a couple of examples. So the late, great Justice Scalia talked about how the Constitution did not protect equal rights, right? And if you don't like hearing from a Republican, the same thing for Ruth Bader Ginsburg. The notorious RBG said that the Constitution does not protect equal rights for women. So what does that translate to? So we need a hook. In constitutional law, there are different levels of scrutiny. What does that mean? Whatever your action that you're doing, we judge it on either low-level scrutiny, intermediate scrutiny, or high scrutiny. Strict scrutiny is the highest level of scrutiny. That's what applies for race, that's what applies for religion, but not for gender, okay? So what does that change? So let me give you a couple of examples of why it's important. There's a young lady named Christy, a college freshman, who was raped by a group of football players, and she brought her case to the Supreme Court, which swiftly struck it down with a provision under the Violence Against Women Act, which was based on the Commerce Clause. That was her constitutional hook. But they said that that was not sufficient for her to maintain her claim, so she could not get any redress. Let me tell you about Jessica Gonzalez. She had 3 daughters that were killed when a police officer failed to enforce a restraining order against her husband. Why did her case not make it through? Simple. The Supreme Court held that the order of protection was not covered by her rights under the 5th Amendment of the Constitution, so there was no constitutional basis for her claim. No constitutional hook, no protection. So some people think this is just a women thing. It's not. Men are impacted too. Let me tell you about the Supreme Court case called Nugent. In 2001, the Supreme Court held that Nugent's deportation from the U.S. was valid. Let me tell you about Nugent. So there was a gentleman who went to serve the military overseas. He had a son abroad. He brought that son home and raised him as a single father. The son grew up. After 18, got in trouble, something low level, but then ended up getting deported to a country he had never known. Why? Because as a man, his citizenship did not transfer abroad as if it was a woman. If Nugent was born to a woman abroad, he would have automatically become a citizen. And that's how our immigration laws are written. So if the ERA was in place, it would have protected them. So it's not something that just impacts women, it impacts both of us alike. The point is, we just want to make sure that men and women are treated equal. So that's the implication of the ERA. I mean, it's something that's so basic that people think it's already a thing, but it's not yet a thing, and it needs to be.
Great answer. I'm glad you mentioned intermediate scrutiny, because that applies to so many issues, from women in combat to a variety of others, and you just mentioned some great cases right there. So my next question is going to be for both of the panelists. I'll start off with Dr. Dyer and then work to Representative Joseph. Dr. Dyer, if you could talk about the constitutional process of passing an amendment. We know that we need 2/3 of Congress, which the ERA has, but then there's a ratification period within the House. Can you tell me a little bit about the history of the ERA? It's been around from the 70s, a little bit about what some of the debates are, just briefly, and then what can college students do to get involved in this political process if they so choose to get involved in? And then I'll ask the same question to Representative Joseph.
Okay, so the history of the ERA is really an outgrowth of the kind of, I guess, what wave? That would be the sort of the second wave of the feminist movement in the attempt to really push forward at a legal level, right, as Representative Joseph has said, right, a real constitutional basis for equality amongst sexes. And if we situated in the 1970s, there's a lot of things that we take for granted today that were on the books in the 60s and 70s. If you were a woman, you couldn't apply for a credit card. You had to have your husband's approval, right? Meaning financially you were considered dependent, essentially, on your husband. In many states, it was on the books that your husband could legally rape you because, well, it's a marriage, and isn't it the woman's right to have sex with her, or not right, the woman's duty to have sex with her husband. Therefore, how can it be a crime? So these are the kinds of things we were addressing in this period, right? And stuff that we kind of take for granted that, oh, there's no way there was a law like that. But when we go back and examine it, right, many of the things on the books, right, kept people in a legally subordinate position, right? So there's a lot at stake in the ERA fight. And that would kind of put an end to a lot of, even some of these vestiges that are still on the books. I think students can get involved in any kind of activity from the participatory level in the discussions in classrooms to participation in the voting process to really going out there and advocating for it. A lot of us, the foundation is educating ourselves and deciding to really put some action behind it. A lot of us today, since we're on social media, we think if we tweet a little bit, we did our part, right? That's really basic and really low level and not enough. As you know, you may have tweeted about 100 issues and then you're kind of like, wow, that problem's still there. So we have to figure out ways, right, to kind of really concretize, right, our activism, right, or our participation in crafting a vision for this country, right? And I think, to me, this comes back to another big issue. There are a lot of powerful interests in this country that are currently planning out and building a future that they want you to inhabit. And right now, I mean, there's very few of us in this room can say we're taking part in planning out and crafting a vision for a new and better country. A lot of us, we are going to work and we're going to school, and the minute that we get home, we need to chill out because we have to detox from all the things that we did in the day, and we have other people who are gonna try to set the agenda for the next 50 or 100 years, right? So it's really our responsibility, right, in a democratic nation to say, like, this is our country, right, and this is the future that we get to take hold of, right? And I think there's, like, steps where we can amend the Constitution. That's fantastic, right? And I think we need to go even beyond that, right, and think about what kind of really substantive changes we want, right? And those are the kind of conversations I think a lot of us like to have here at Miami-Dade College. I know they're having that in Professor Tapia's class. We hopefully have those in my classes as well. I actually had, is it possible that I ask Representative Joseph a question within this thing about the ERA? So the ERA guarantees equality. Is there any danger, because there's a conservative criticism of the ERA of like, I don't have the conservative.
I think I know what you're about.
I have a question about
and it's the one we talked about before.
about equality versus, like, so for example, if women
Wait.
are there special? Go ahead.
Wait. I think I know. And strategically, I'm not gonna let you ask that question out loud.
Really?
No, go ahead. Ask the question out
No,
loud.
so there's sort of like this idea that so are there demands that women have that are not or that are specific to their sex that require redress that don't fall under equality, and could, like an equal rights amendment, somehow be used against women having specific demands that aren't equal to men? So for example, specific forms of health care they need access to as opposed to men or something like that. Is there a danger in that, or is this provision of equality more just like a basic kind of?
So my overall answer is it should not be. But could there be? There's always a possibility. You know, as an attorney, people pay me to think bad thoughts. Like, what's the worst case scenario? The worst case scenario is, well, you want it to be equal, and somebody can misinterpret it that way, but it would be a gross misinterpretation of what the ERA is designed to address. But to answer your question in a practical way, like, for example, I'm going to be working on a Pregnancy Discrimination Act this cycle. And that's something that's specific to women. Men are not going to deal with pregnancy. Sure, paternity leave, maternity leave after the baby's born is one thing, but that gestational period while the baby is being produced is strictly a woman's thing, right? So how does the law account for that to make sure, well, because she's a woman, she needs this time off or she needs this accommodation, and you can't punish her for it, right? So it's designed to create that level of layer of protection to say she has just a right to work as this person, knowing that this has to happen, and it's beyond her control, so to speak, because of her sex. So there's a book I'm going to highlight for those who really want to dig deep, because this is a book by Angela Davis called Women, Race, and Class. It is hardcore if you want to get into some of the things with racism and feminism in the country, and even within the feminist movement, of racism within the feminist movement. But again, like with any movement, there are going to be some factions that are for it, some factions that are against it, how people who were once allies went ahead and turned on you because they didn't want black men to have the right to vote, but they wanted women to right to, I mean, just a whole lot of drama, and it's all in this book. So if you're curious about getting a lot more details on this topic, I would recommend Women, Race, and Class by Angela Davis. I'm going to go back and circle back to something you said earlier about how women were treated under the law, not being able to get credit cards. A lot of that stems from a system called coverture, which is a legal system that was brought over to the United States from England, which basically made women property. So you couldn't even own, as a woman, you couldn't own property. If you got married, that property then transferred automatically to your husband. And you took his last name. The only instances that I know of people taking other people's last name is slavery and marriage, just as a side note, little observation. But the point is, you became that person's property. And along with that came all of the limitations that have since been kind of rolled back, but could easily go the other way, depending on how the pendulum swings and whether or not people continue to advocate for their rights.
Perfect. And Representative Joseph, how do you feel that young people can get involved advocating, maybe it is for the Equal Rights Amendment, maybe it's getting involved in the political process or working a campaign or voting or bringing out voting awareness? What are some ways that you recommend young people can get involved? And can you tell them how important it is within the ratification process? Because in order for an amendment to be valid, like I said, there's multiple methods that you could amend the Constitution according to Article 5. One of the methods is 2/3 of Congress, but then you also need 3/4 of the state legislatures. Right now, that means 38 states. We're at 37 states that have ratified the Equal Rights Amendment. So if Florida ratifies, it would be the 38th state. It would basically mean that Florida was the last state to put the Equal Rights Amendment into the Constitution. So how important is it for young people and people who feel passionate about to get involved?
All right, so I'll take the last question first. The Equal Rights Amendment just needs one more state. I'm competitive, so I would love Florida to be the last state, but I can't control that. Like, there are a couple other states that are vying to be the last state. But even if and when that happens, there's still going to be another procedure, because the time period within which that they had set the amendment to get passed and ratified by the states has passed. Now, there are constitutional questions about whether they could even put a time limit on there, because the Constitution doesn't. So if the Constitution doesn't require a time limit, how can Congress just unilaterally, just arbitrarily decide that they're going to put a time limit? So there's legal arguments there. On top of that, in the past, there have also been instances where the time limit has passed, where Congress has passed it, the sufficient number of Congress has passed it, but not enough ratification by the states. And that's I think the 21st Amendment, where Congress basically decided to give themselves a pay raise. They didn't get the numbers in advance, but they got it later, 100 years later, and then they went ahead and moved forward with the whole thing. So a similar argument could easily be made with the ERA. So that's the technical stuff out of the way. Now, in terms of your other question, which was how to get involved politically. So, or it may not be politically, it could be just in terms of legislation. So there are lots of ways to get involved, either as a volunteer, or as an intern. My office is accepting interns. We have different kinds of internships and fellowships. It just depends on what you want to do. If you're passionate about women's rights, if you're passionate about climate justice, if you don't even know what you're passionate about, you just want to get involved, right? I will leave my contact information with Professor Tapia, and he can get that to you. But I will also put in a plug. My office is looking for a district executive secretary. What does that mean? So if you're currently full-time in school, this is not for you. But if you know somebody who recently graduated, this is a full-time position. And what you would do is basically serve as like a community liaison. In addition to like the general secretarial duties, you'd represent me in my absence when I'm in Tallahassee. So you'd be like the person going and talking to people. And that might not be a thing for you yet, but it's something that could easily be developed. So the point is, there are lots of ways to get involved, and think about somebody who does something that you think is marginally cool or that you would like to emulate, and then just volunteer for them. Follow them around for a little bit and see what it is, and then you'll decide if you like it or not.
Perfect. And we have enough time, because I know Representative Joseph has to leave at 12 o'clock, so it's 11:53. We have enough time to open up the microphones and maybe get one or two questions, and then we'll continue the question process, but I know at 12 o'clock, Representative Joseph needs to go. So if you want to ask a question, it's available at the two microphones. I see one or two people getting eager to stand up and go to the microphones. I looked down and I saw one. I saw in their faces, they want to ask the question. It's all about who goes first. Congratulations, sir, you're breaking the ice.
Hello?
Give us your name.
My name's Luis Pardo, and I have a question for Representative Joseph. I was just wondering if you could give us some examples of voter suppression in Florida.
Sure. So there was a period, a couple of different ones. So one would be, they started doing a voter purge, and this is something that's going on right now in a couple of different counties, Broward, not so much in Miami-Dade, but a couple of others, where they're going on and setting some random criteria to purge their voter rolls to make sure that it's clean and updated. the problem with that is and the way they're doing it is if you haven't voted in a certain number of the past elections, and they're just taking you off the rolls. But what if you just chose not to vote in the past couple of elections? Why should you be removed from the voter rolls? You're already registered. Why can't you just stay registered? Why do you require that refreshing of registration? Because they know in certain counties, when those people show up to vote, they're voting a particular way, and they don't like the way that those people vote. So they're making up excuses so there's something in the law called disparate impact, right? So something on its face might seem very neutral, it's race neutral, it's not targeting a particular race, any particular ethnicity, or any particular gender. But the impact of that thing is it disenfranchises or impacts a particular group. When I would, and that's my cue to order my Uber, when I would sue companies or organizations for employment discrimination, there was one particular case that went all the way up to the Supreme Court. And what it was a policy that this particular company had once you reach certain age, then you can't qualify for this particular promotion. Well, that on its face is something that is not neutral. It's specifically identifying age, and that's age discrimination. Well, I also, with the NAACP, sued the North Bergen Fire Department because they had a policy that said you had to live in a certain perimeter of the city to be able to qualify for this job or to get bonus points, right? The impact of that is because of the segregated nature of that area, it basically excluded the black applicants. Maybe one or two squeaked by, but a majority ended up being white. So even though on its face it was neutral, right, and it almost made sense, the impact of it was it automatically excluded the few black folks that could otherwise qualify. Does that make sense? Yeah. So it's the same kind of concept with these voter registration things. Like right now, we just passed Amendment 4, right? Everybody advocated for it. We want our returning citizens to be able to fully vote. Do you know that over a quarter, 26% of the people in the United States that cannot vote because of a criminal record reside in the state of Florida? Let that sink in. Over a quarter in the entire United States. Why? Because we have a history of systematic racism in our voting laws. So even though everybody overwhelmingly said that we want these people to vote, the legislature still managed to figure out a way to add financial, remember we talked about wealthy white men at the beginning of the Constitution, the financial piece to make it so that that's what your right to vote hangs on. So if you can afford to pay off this thing, then you can vote. If you can't afford, you can't vote. What are we doing? Anyway, y'all gonna get me all riled up.
All right.
Good? All right.
So, do we have enough time for, actually,
You can.
one more question for Representative Joseph before she has to head out. I saw some people over here that were burning to ask a question. I saw it. Nobody? I know you have a question? Perfect. Go to the microphone. Guys, don't be shy. You guys aren't this shy in class.
It doesn't have to be about what we talked about.
Yeah, just one thing I was curious about is why hasn't the ERA been passed yet? Because you said that Florida was the last state and that this topic has, for decades has been discussed.
Great question. So even though the ERA is something that was initially championed by Republicans, for some reason it's become a partisan issue. And Republicans are just not trying to hear it. The Women's Caucus of Florida, when I bring it up, you should see their eyes glaze over. Yeah, not going to happen. Really? Why not going to happen? And it's really just become a partisan thing for no real reason. And that's the case with a lot of other issues that are bubbling up, like equal pay or paid family leave. For whatever reason, the current Republicans in office, even though actual Republicans who vote are in favor of things like this, they're just not trying to hear it because politically they see that as a win for Democrats that they're just not trying to do.
Thank you.
Can I add to that too? So one of the issues too is that when the ERA was coming out, it was almost, people thought it was inevitable, right? But then what happened was highly organized, actually conservative women in particular led the fight against it. And they portrayed it as actually an attack on women. This is sort of why I asked this question to Representative Joseph about would women sort of lose protection for specific things, right? This is actually a relevant thing for me. My wife and I, we just had a baby, and a lot of friends I know, they say, we're pregnant. And I never say that. I think it's so ridiculous. My wife's actually pregnant because I don't have to carry the kid. It's a whole different thing. It's our kid, but, whatever. So it's silly. But people portrayed it and they said, actually, the ERA, in spite of what it's going to do, right, is actually an attack on women because it's going to take away, right, any kind of special protections that women had. And people were able to kind of manipulate that and portray it like in this sort of growing culture war as a victory for the Democrats and kind of like people who are basically anti-family values. And which is, you know, many of our families, we believe that like families are based on equality and love and respect. And that's at the basis of the Equal Rights Amendment. So it's kind of ironic that was the way to sort of attack it. Right?
Yeah.
That was the strategy used.
Like a big argument they used to use is, oh, women are going to be subject to the draft now. Well, women are already subject to the draft as of 2016, so that's like a non-issue anymore. And I mean, there was a whole host of issues that they would try to make up. None of them actually made sense at the end of the day, but they were powerful enough to slow down the movement such that they didn't get the number of ratifications needed on the state level.
Perfect. Any other questions? Well, seeing none, please join me in thanking both Representative Joseph and Dr. Dyer in coming out to Constitution Day.
Woohoo!
Thank you for attending, and if you have any other questions, we're going to be up here. I know some of you guys are shy, don't want to ask publicly, but I know Dr. Dyer is going to still be here, and Representative Joseph has to catch that flight out to Tallahassee. Thank you again.